Charles Fraser. The Devil's Work. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 11. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production. "Ah, here you are at last," Holmes greeted me with a stern look as I returned from my daily walk and was just about to hang my coat on the hook. "Have you been waiting for me?" I asked Holmes, for I could not explain his reproachful words. "Indeed I have," he said, glancing at his pocket watch and adding, "In precisely 3 minutes we have an appointment with Mr. Bellhouse." Feeling guilty, I took my coat back from the hook, slipped into it, and answered meekly, "I must have forgotten about that, but I am ready. We can leave straight away." Disapprovingly, Holmes clicked his tongue and said, "You can take your coat off again. We are meeting Mr. here in our quarters." Then Holmes turned away and sat down in his favourite armchair, crossed his legs, and lit his cigar. I hung my coat back on the wall hook once again and took a seat opposite him. "What is there to know about this Bellhouse?" I asked Holmes. "Does Bellhouse cloths mean anything to you?" "Do you mean the enormous tailoring business?" Holmes nodded. "And do you already know why Mr. is coming to see us?" "There appears to have been a kidnapping case. That's all I know at present." The word kidnapping sent chills down my spine. I could remember my own kidnapping all too well, and my half-frozen toes began to tingle again. A shudder ran through me and I swallowed hard. Holmes scrutinised me critically. "You survived it well, old friend. It is over," he said in a soothing tone. Nevertheless, I could not shake off the feeling of unease that suddenly overcame me. There was a knock at the door, and before Holmes or I could answer, Alice had already shown our guest in. "Mister," Holmes greeted and rose laboriously. He extended his hand towards him and bade him to take a seat. "May I bring you gentlemen anything? Perhaps some tea?" Alice asked the group. "Mo, not for me, thank you." Bellhouse declined, and both Holmes and I gratefully waved off the offer. Thus Alice withdrew, and as the door clicked shut behind her, Holmes said, "Mister, what can Dr. Watson and I do for you?" Mr. drew a deep breath and said, "As you already know, my son has been kidnapped." "Your son? No, I was not yet aware of that," Holmes clarified. "You mentioned something about a kidnapping, yes, but not that it concerned your son." "I have done everything that the kidnapper or kidnappers demanded of me," Bellhouse lamented, "but I have not seen my son again to this day." "How long has your son been missing?" asked Holmes. I had actually thought the kidnapping had only just occurred. "No, my son has been missing for exactly 5 days now," Mr. Bellhouse replied sadly. "Are you quite certain that your son has been kidnapped? Perhaps he has simply taken some time away for himself," I said. Thereupon, Mr. pulled a folded note from his jacket pocket. He placed it on his knees, unfolded it, and handed it to me. "Believe me, I am quite certain." Now I held a white sheet of paper in my hands, upon which various letter clippings had been pasted. I could practically sense Holmes's burgeoning curiosity, and there he was at my side, reaching for the sheet of paper and saying, "Let me see that, Watson." And just like that, my friend had snatched the ransom note and was studying it silently. After a few minutes, he read aloud, "I have your son. Bring £500,000 within the next 48 hours to the corner of Brick Lane and Finch Street. Leave the money just inside the entrance of the empty warehouse. If the 48 hours expire, your son will be dead. No police." "Mr. Bellhouse, you said you had already complied with all demands. Have you already paid the £500,000? Holmes asked incredulously. "Of course I paid," Bellhouse nodded gravely. "I did not involve the police either. However, 2 more days have now passed since the deadline expired, and there is still no trace of my son. That is why I have come to you." "I see," said Holmes curtly, while scratching his chin thoughtfully. "Did you notice anything in the warehouse mentioned? Who owns the building? What interior was inside? Or rather, was there anything at all remaining in the warehouse?" Bellhouse shook his head. "I haven't the faintest idea. I entered the warehouse very cautiously until I determined I was likely alone. I called out for my son several times, but could only hear the echoing sound of Simon. Otherwise, the warehouse was empty. But wait, there is something. In the far corner, it looked to me as if someone occasionally slept there. Perhaps some youths, or a homeless person. No idea. I definitely saw some blankets, candles, and food remnants. Oh yes, and there were a few empty barrels in the back section as well. Nothing unusual for an empty warehouse, if you ask me." "Corner of Brick Lane and Finch Street, you said?" I interjected. "Precisely so," Mr. agreed. Meanwhile, Holmes handed Mr. a pen and notepad and asked him to write down all friends, their addresses and employers. "Whatever comes to mind," said Holmes, giving Bellhouse a brief smile. But then he became serious again. "Were there any enemies or envious people that your son Simon had? Anyone he might have mentioned in passing?" "Nothing of the sort," replied Bellhouse, while straining to complete the list Holmes had requested. "Mister, exactly how old is your son and what is his occupation?" Holmes wanted to know. Bellhouse put down his pen and snorted audibly before launching into his answer. "The lad has only just turned 18, and occupation," he scoffed. "Don't make me laugh. He loiters about all the blessed day long, keeps my employees from their work, or begs me for money. That's what my son does all day long." Speechless at this tirade of abuse, I looked at Holmes, who had listened to Mister's words with similar dismay. "You sir, my next question regarding your relationship with your son has thus been answered," Holmes noted with a slightly sarcastic undertone. "How far along are you with the list?" he asked Mister further. "Please do add your private address at the bottom. I assume we shall find you at the tailor's shop during the day?" But of course," said Bellhouse, sliding the completed list to Holmes. "Have you any other questions?" "That will be all for the moment. Thank you, Mister. We shall begin our investigation straight away and keep you informed of any developments. Should we require anything further from you, we now know where to find you," said Holmes, waving Mister's list. 2 hours later, Holmes and I entered the aforementioned warehouse at the corner of Brick Lane and Finch Street. Inside, it was gloomy. Light barely filtered through the covered windows, which were draped with cobwebs. I pulled out my torch and swept the spacious room from all angles. A few large wooden barrels stood against the back wall. Some rubbish had accumulated on the floor, and several rats scurried away at the sight of my beam of light. Holmes and I walked through the room together. Mister had been right. In the back right corner, half hidden behind some wooden planks that had been stacked into a disorderly, waist-high pile, there was something like a sleeping area. Several blankets lay on the floor, and a bundle of clothes had been rolled up to serve as a makeshift pillow. In front of this stood a large metal bowl containing charred wood. "Someone appears to have made themselves rather comfortable here," I said. Holmes shot me one of his looks and replied with raised eyebrows. "Comfortable is rather relative in this case." Holmes bent over the sleeping area and began rummaging through the blankets. I stood beside him, illuminating the area with my torch. He uncovered a half-full bottle containing a clear liquid, a partially eaten sandwich, and a single sock. Holmes first opened the bottle and smelled it. "Water?" I asked. "Ah, hardly," replied Holmes. "Cheap moonshine would be more accurate." He turned the bottle in all directions. "No label or trademark," he observed. Then he picked up the half-eaten sandwich and wrinkled his nose in disgust. "Not exactly what one would call exquisite." "Do you want to smell the sock as well?" I asked, slightly amused. That won't be necessary, faithful colleague. I can see at first glance that the garment in question has been worn, and on multiple occasions. How does that help us now? I asked. Holmes pondered briefly. Were it not for the sock, I would say this sleeping place belongs to a beggar or homeless person who occasionally takes up quarters here. However, the sock is of exceedingly high and expensive quality. How can you claim that from a single sock? I asked, irritated. Ma, quite simple, said Holmes. This sock is a model from the Hugo brand. The German-born company is widely known for its quality and chic. I shook my head. This man managed time and time again, even after all these many years together, to astonish me. Why the devil do you suddenly know about fashion, and how do you recognise that the sock is from Hugo? It is embroidered here. Holmes grinned broadly and held the sock under my nose. I politely declined. And this single sock destroys my theory of the homeless person. And now? I asked, for I had no idea how we should proceed. I suggest we now pay a direct visit to Bellhouse Clothes and make our way through questioning the employees. Phew, you mean what the relationship between father and son is like? But that has nothing to do with this case, I observed. All information is relevant, countered Holmes, and the more we can learn, the better. A short while later, we found ourselves standing before the rather impressive company building of Bellhouse Clothes. Why are you grinning like that? I asked my friend, who had a broad smile across his face. Isn't it splendid, Watson, how quickly we've been getting from A to B lately? I let out a disgruntled grumble, thus not further engaging with Holmes's delight about automobiles. The good, time-tested, horse-drawn carriages were disappearing more and more, and it had become easier to get a taxi than a hansom cab. Ever devoted to progress and technology, Holmes found this circumstance more than brilliant. I, however, missed the clip-clop of hooves, the scent of horses in short, travelling by carriage. I was getting old. No, I had to admit to myself, I am old. Sighing, I followed Holmes up the few steps that led directly to the main entrance of the company building. At reception sat a young lady in her mid-30s, whose smart suit was adorned with the Bellhouse emblem. Excellent advertising, I thought to myself, just as the lady asked, "Welcome to Bellhouse Clothes. How may I be of assistance to you, gentlemen?" I am Sherlock Holmes. My friend took the lead and introduced us. And this is my partner, Dr. Watson. We are here on behalf of your superior, Mr. himself, and would like to have a look around. The receptionist appeared briefly uncertain and considered, then said, "Would the gentleman kindly take a seat? I must, of course, first clear this with Mr. But you are in luck. He is presently in the building. I shall return in a few moments." Holmes and I took our seats in the designated places. Whilst I looked around the room, Holmes had already picked up the company newsletter and was leafing through it. "Look here, Watson, a photograph of the Bellhouse family." I leant slightly towards Holmes and saw Mr. in the newspaper, holding his wife in his arms. Both smiled delightedly at the camera, whilst a young man stood somewhat apart, displaying a pained smile. "A happy family," I remarked ironically. Holmes had no time to answer, as the receptionist appeared. "Mr. sends his regards and has confirmed your statement. I hope you understand that I had to verify this first. I am to inform you that you have complete freedom of action in our company." Then she paused briefly. "May I show you anything specific?" No, thank you very much. Please don't trouble yourself. Dr. Watson and I would just like to have a look around and chat with one or two people." "As you wish, gentlemen. Through this door, along the corridor, and you will come directly to our factory premises." "Thank you very much," replied Holmes whilst already pushing me through the door. We walked along the long, unadorned corridor, and I whispered to Holmes, "What exactly are we looking for?" "I cannot tell you precisely at this moment, my dear fellow," said Holmes. At the end of the corridor, there was a heavy iron door. We opened it and found ourselves in the middle of the production area. We looked around until Holmes headed straight towards an elderly man at a table. At first, the man did not notice us, but then dropped his piece of fabric in sheer fright. "May I help you?" he asked, startled. "We shall see about that. My name is Holmes. This is my partner, Dr. Watson. We are conducting inquiries on behalf of Mr. regarding his son Simon. Could you tell me anything about Simon Bellhouse?" The elderly man seemed even more astonished by this question than by our sudden appearance. "What has the lad gone and done now?" was his reply. Apparently, the kidnapping had not yet become public knowledge and had not spread among the employees. "As far as I know, nothing," said Holmes. "What is the relationship like between father and son?" The elderly man burst out laughing. "I certainly won't say anything about that." He twisted his face in contempt. "But good old Jimmy, over there at the cutting table, surely isn't as tight-lipped as I am. He'll certainly tell you what you want to hear." With that, the elderly man turned away and returned to his work. Holmes glanced at me briefly, shrugged his shoulders, and marched straight towards the aforementioned Jimmy. The latter saw us coming and immediately put down his scissors. "Good day. My name is Sherlock Holmes and this is my partner, Dr. Watson. Are you Jimmy?" "Yes, sir," he replied. "Why do you want to know?" The young Jimmy scrutinised Holmes and me suspiciously from head to toe. "We are conducting investigations on behalf of Mr. regarding his son Simon. Could you tell me anything about their relationship?" Jimmy also burst out laughing. "Relationship is a good one. That good-for-nothing is sponging his way through the life his father enables him to have. He's work-shy, too good to lift a finger. We're all beneath him here, except perhaps Agnes." "Who is Agnes, then?" Holmes probed. "Agnes works in the next hall, in the dyeing department. Simon has had his eye on her for a long time, but Agnes is too clever and too good for that wannabe." "Do you think Agnes could tell us more about Simon Bellhouse?" "Pah!" Jimmy spat out. "Of course! He's constantly forcing himself on her. He still hasn't understood that Agnes wants nothing to do with him." "Thank you for your time then, Jimmy. We wish you a good day." Holmes and I said our goodbyes and searched the enormous hall for another door. Slowly but surely, I'm getting the feeling that young Simon isn't particularly well liked amongst the staff. "One could say that indeed," Holmes agreed with me. "I am curious to hear Agnes's perspective on this." Upon arriving at the dyeing workshop, Holmes and I stood there searching at first. Around 30 women were present in this smaller hall, busy giving the fabrics various colours. We had to inquire about Agnes until we finally found her gossiping with a young woman of about the same age. Holmes introduced us and explained our concern. This Agnes might have been quite attractive, but she did not seem particularly bright. Theatrically, she placed her flat hand against her forehead and lamented. "Simon has disappointed me so. All the things he promised me, and now he won't show his face anymore." "When did you last see him?" asked Holmes. Agnes pondered briefly. "I haven't seen him for at least 6 days, and normally he visits me here daily at work." "Do you know if young Simon has any enemies?" I asked. "Enemies? Not Simon. At most, people who envy him. Well, what can I say? As soon as someone is wealthy, good-looking and intelligent, people begrudge them their success, even his own father." "His father?" asked Holmes, bewildered. "What do you mean by that?" "Ah, well, Simon wanted to go travelling around the world and asked his father for £100,000, but his father clearly begrudged him that. He wouldn't part with a single measly penny, even though that would have been peanuts for his father." "You see, perhaps his father simply believes that one must earn one's money first," I said, perhaps a bit too agitated. No, he simply begrudged him and envied that Simon is so young and good-looking and can travel the whole world. Moreover, Simon promised to take me with him. Ah, now I see which way the wind is blowing, I thought to myself, and one look at Holmes's face confirmed my suspicion. Have you any idea where Simon might be at present? Asked Holmes. Leroy, Agnes fired back instantly. If Simon isn't with Leroy, then he at least knows where he is. I'm absolutely certain of that. Thank you very much for your help, Agnes. Ah, tell Simon if he doesn't show up soon, he can forget about working with us, she called after us. I shall pass that on to him. Good day. Evening had fallen. Holmes and I had meanwhile returned home to Baker Street and made ourselves comfortable in our armchairs. What conclusions do you draw from our visit to the tailor's shop today? Holmes asked me. Well, now, it was rather enlightening, I would say, although opinions about young Simon seem to lie in the eye of the beholder. Yeah, well put, Watson, Holmes smiled. The charmingly rudimentary Agnes already sees her world tour slipping away, whilst the simple-minded Jimmy is hopelessly smitten with Agnes and hasn't a kind word to say about young Bellhouse. He can't be entirely wrong in his assessment, though. The elderly gentleman we spoke to first practically confirmed as much, and old Bellhouse himself sings from the same hymn sheet. So shall we pay this Leroy a visit tomorrow? I inquired. Holmes nodded. Holmes, I exclaimed excitedly. We have forgotten to ask where we might find this Leroy. But Holmes merely pulled a sheet of paper from his pocket and waved it about. The list, of course. Old Bellhouse has also noted down a certain Leroy Staton on it, along with his address, and judging by the place of residence, this Leroy must be none other than the industrial heir Staton. Birds of a feather flock together, was all I could think of. The next day, at 10:30 in the morning, we stepped out of the taxi that had chauffeured us directly to the posh address. Holmes rang the bell, and seconds later, a maid opened the door. May I help you? She asked haughtily. We are Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson, and we would like to speak with Leroy Staton. Is he at home? Holmes inquired. Mr. Staton is having breakfast at the moment. I don't think he wishes to be disturbed. Having breakfast? At this hour? I'm already thinking about lunch, I interjected, completely baffled. The maid looked down at me with raised eyebrows in a condescending manner. Please do ask Mr. Staton if it might not be possible to disturb him briefly. We shall be gone again straight away. However, it would be of the utmost urgency. It concerns his friend Simon Bellhouse. Would you kindly relay that to him? As you wish, the woman replied coldly and slammed the door in our faces. Bewildered, we stared at each other until Holmes said, Politeness and decency need not automatically find their way into wealthy or rich households. I suppose not, I said curtly, but at that moment the door was already being opened again. Mr. Staton asks you to come in. If you would kindly follow me, the maid requested. We traversed several lavishly furnished salons. Rooms would be the understatement of the year, until we finally arrived at the generously proportioned terrace where young Staton was taking his breakfast. Our arrival was hardly worth him looking up from his plate. Holmes cleared his throat audibly. Only then did young Staton grant us a small portion of his attention. What can I do for you? Good day, Mr. Staton. My name is Sherlock Holmes, and this is my partner, Dr. Watson. We are investigating the disappearance of your friend Simon Bellhouse. Simon has disappeared? Inquired Leroy Staton with surprise, placing his sandwich back on his plate. I had no idea. When did you last see Simon? Holmes pressed. Well, let me think for a moment. It must have been quite a while ago. A week, perhaps? 10 days? I cannot say with any certainty right now. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling. The room was slowly growing lighter again. Night was receding, and the first birds had already begun to chirp. Suddenly, I heard our flat door being carefully opened and closed again. Holmes must have returned. I swung my legs out of bed, reached for my dressing gown and hastily put it on. Then I called out, "Holmes, is that you?" "That's rather a lot of questions all at once," Leroy complained. "Two, to be precise," Holmes retorted. "I should think you can manage with 2 simple questions." I could practically feel the aversion Holmes harboured towards this Leroy. The sympathies were clearly mutual, as young Staton replied snappishly, "Unlike you, presumably, I am not yet suffering from dementia." Staton made a brief pause and let his words sink in before continuing in a smug tone. "Simon was here at my home. We talked about sport, rugby, you understand?" "Rugby?" Holmes repeated monosyllabically. "You did not discuss that your friend intended to take a world trip with Agnes, and that his father refused to give him the necessary money for it." "A world trip? Agnes? Mr. Holmes, I do not understand what you are trying to tell me. I know nothing about any world trip, nor am I acquainted with any Agnes." Leroy Staton leant back, crossed his arms stubbornly, and swung his legs over one another. "Mr. Staton, may I inquire as to your plans for the rest of today?" This question, posed by Holmes, took Leroy Staton by surprise. "I shall visit my father's office shortly and, for better or worse, suffer through the tedious bookkeeping." "I gather from your statement that you're not exactly thrilled about that," Holmes observed. "Please don't misunderstand me. I am indeed very interested in my father's company. After all, I am the one who will inherit it one day. However, my task will be to tell people what to do and how to perform their work. Someone must be in charge and direct people, after all. Rest assured, I shall employ an accountant for such matters." I believed Holmes had heard enough and said, "Mr. Staton, thank you for your time. I expect we shall meet again soon. Good day." "Yeah, what do you mean by that?" Staton called after us, but Holmes and I were already in the process of leaving the estate, and Holmes seemed to visibly enjoy leaving the young, arrogant Staton in uncertainty. Holmes and I turned our backs on the Statons' house and walked along the street, hoping to quickly catch a taxi. "We absolutely must return to the warehouse." Holmes sounded quite excited, and I had trouble keeping up with his brisk pace. "Do you think we have overlooked something?" I asked curiously. "We must. This Staton is involved in the kidnapping. I am absolutely certain of that." "But Holmes, are you already telling me who you think the culprit is? Are you feeling unwell? You're not about to kick the bucket, are you?" I asked, amused. Holmes stopped abruptly and looked at me sternly. "I feel agile and fit. You, on the other hand, if you'll pardon my saying so, appear somewhat wilted today." Holmes laughed. "Jesting aside, old friend, I fear that this is no longer merely a staged kidnapping, but rather a genuine abduction." "Staged? Real?" I exclaimed indignantly. "Whatever makes you think that? And why Staton? In my opinion, that Jimmy from the clothing factory makes a rather suitable culprit, complete with a motive of jealousy." "Watson, what did Staton have for breakfast?" "I believe it was a sandwich, but I don't understand, Holmes." "A sandwich, precisely. A sandwich capable of numbing every taste bud, topped with ham, jam, blue cheese and honey." Holmes wrinkled his nose in disgust. "And what did we find at the sleeping spot in the warehouse?" "A sandwich!" I exclaimed excitedly. "A sandwich, consisting of the very same revolting toppings as mentioned before. And do you recall the socks? They too fit the image of Leroy Staton." "Holmes, please enlighten me. When did you think the kidnapping was staged, and why not any more? For my part, I have always believed it to be a genuine kidnapping." I babbled incomprehensibly. The thought that the whole thing could be staged occurred to me early on, when Agnes told us that Simon Bellhouse begged his father for £100,000 for a world trip. His father did not give it to him as hoped. What does the little son do? Exactly. he obtains the money by other means, and the fact that his friend Statten was in cahoots with him is proven by the chosen location for the money handover. The factory where Leroy Statten usually hangs about. But don't you find it strange that Simon hasn't surfaced yet despite receiving the money? But could he not have started his world trip straight away? I speculated. It would be possible, Holmes briefly agreed with me, but not very likely. How would he explain his return home after his world trip? After such a long time of absence, or rather disappearance, it would be far simpler to spin his father a yarn and concoct some tale about a semester abroad or something of the sort. Holmes, how cunning you are! London can count itself fortunate that you stand and fight on the light side rather than the dark side. Thank you for the flowers, Watson, but let us continue spinning our thoughts. So, if Simon had received the money, he would have resurfaced by now. What does that tell us? Not yet, he replied. First, we have something else to take care of. Holmes opened the window of the room, then went back to the dovecote and opened the door. He took out one bird and went with it to the window. Fly free for Dave's son, he murmured. Then he took out the next dove and said, Fly free for Christine's daughter. We released more doves for Wilson, and also one for his cat Barney, one for Dave's mother, one for Dr. Fistel, and finally one each for Dave and Christine. They were the perpetrators and had caused much pain, yet they too had suffered greatly. Correct, Watson. Therefore, someone else must have pocketed the money. And who else would be a likely candidate but our mutual friend Leroy Statten? But that makes no sense. This Leroy has plenty of money himself, I interjected. His father, yes, but not him, Holmes corrected. He is just another spoilt little fellow who wants to get his hands on his father's money as quickly as possible and is even willing to endure accounting for it. Holmes rolled his eyes in exasperation. Taxi! I called out and quickly raised my hand. The motor car stopped right beside us, and Holmes and I quickly got in. Very good, Watson, Holmes praised me. Sir, please take us to the corner of Brick Lane and Finch Street. Once again we stood before the abandoned warehouse, and I had to confess that this time an uneasy feeling came over me. Could Simon Bellhouse, who had disappeared, really be in this warehouse, waiting impatiently for his imminent liberation? Were we about to be able to free him? In what mental and physical state might he be? When I thought back with horror to my own kidnapping, sheer panic immediately overcame me. On the other hand, this warehouse seemed too accessible, too easy to enter and observe, to keep someone imprisoned for several days. And was it not simply stupid to hold someone captive in the same hall where a ransom exchange had taken place just days before? What if Mr. had informed the police after all? They would have turned the building upside down within minutes. Watson, I heard Holmes's voice. In which spheres are your thoughts circling? Shall we go inside, or take root out here? I briefly shook my head, as if to free it from my train of thought, and forced myself to suppress my own rising panic and focus entirely on my friend and partner Sherlock Holmes. Cautiously and anxiously, I followed Holmes into the empty hall. As I had done the day before, I drew my torch and began illuminating the room. Nothing. The same silence as yesterday. Holmes began to call out, "Mr. Simon, are you here anywhere?" Tensely, we tried to listen for even the faintest sound, but there was nothing. We could neither see nor hear so much as a scurrying rat. Holmes began to meticulously examine the hall, regularly tapping the floor with his walking stick. However, this endeavour proved fruitless. Then Holmes and I began to inspect the walls of the hall. Perhaps there was an undiscovered room hidden behind them, but this attempt too came to nothing. Holmes searched once again through the ceiling storage area that we had discovered yesterday. Here too, we could find no new, revealing insights. Restlessly, I paced about. Then I suddenly stopped in the middle of the hall and looked up at the ceiling. Again, nothing. No gallery, No stairs leading upwards, nowhere where someone could have been hidden. Holmes, I'm slowly beginning to think you've misjudged this one. Try as I might, I cannot find anything that could help us move forward, nor anywhere that Simon Bellhouse could possibly be hidden. Holmes muttered incomprehensible words to himself. He was certain of his position. That much was clear. It troubled him all the more that we were not making any progress. Now, for several minutes, an awkward silence had spread between us with mutual unspoken agreement. "Oh my God!" Holmes suddenly exclaimed, turning chalk white and thus breaking the lingering silence. "What has happened?" I asked my friend with concern. "That I didn't think of this earlier. The barrels!" he cried in horror. "The barrels?" I asked in disbelief. "But surely one cannot hide anyone in there unless—" And the scales fell from my eyes. Unless that person was dead. I must admit, I had completely forgotten about the barrels. True, I noticed them yesterday when we first entered the hall, but then I paid them no further attention. But now, an ice-cold shiver ran through me, and my stomach began to revolt at the mere thought of what we might soon witness. Holmes had already grabbed the first barrel. He examined it professionally, and then remarked that it seemed too light. He tackled the second one, then a third and a fourth. Suddenly he stopped. "Watson," said Holmes so quietly that I could barely hear him, "this barrel is considerably heavier than all the others." I swallowed the lump that had instantly formed in my throat. Then I pulled out my Swiss Army knife, which Holmes had given me together with Alice and Eddy for my last birthday, and hesitantly stepped towards Holmes and the barrel. "Do you really think so, Holmes?" I muttered anxiously. Holmes merely nodded, and I positioned the knife against the stuck lid, hoping for leverage. It proved more difficult than expected, but finally the lid gave way with a loud pop and flew off. A peculiar smell wafted towards us. "That smells like wine," I observed. "Wine with a delicate note of corpse, if you ask me," Holmes corrected, and was ultimately the first to dare look into the barrel. "Do I want to see it?" I asked Holmes. He was now holding his hand in front of his mouth, shook his head and said, "No, you do not. Let us notify Inspector Wolford at once. We have just found the kidnapped Simon Bellhouse." But we did not get that far. As if frozen by thunder, we stared spellbound at the entrance door of the hall, where we could hear a soft but clearly audible rumbling. I was the first to break free from my paralysis and pointed Holmes towards the pile of boards in front of the sleeping area. As fast as our feet and the walking stick could carry us, we ran and limped to the halfway decent hiding place. We anxiously watched the door. Tentatively, it opened very slowly, and someone carefully poked their head in. That head unmistakably belonged to Leroy Staton. Hesitantly, he entered and looked around the hall with an almost timid demeanour. Thank heavens he had not yet noticed the opened wooden barrel, but to my horror, he came straight towards us. Holmes tried to duck even further behind the boards, but I knew our hiding place could not last forever. Resolutely, I drew my revolver and leapt from our cover. "Hands up and don't move!" I called excitedly. My opponent froze. His tense gaze immediately fell upon the barrels. When he realised we had already found Simon, he began to smile maliciously and said, "The two old men from this morning." Holmes replied mockingly, "The spoilt brat. Well, finished with the bookkeeping already?" But Leroy Staton merely laughed, though I was certain it was only for show and the lad was nearly wetting himself. Or perhaps not. With firm steps, he kept approaching us. "I said stop right there and hands up," I shouted at him, trying not to let my voice sound too shrill. "You won't shoot. You're old and weak, and surely you can't shoot at a half-grown young man, and even if you were to shoot, which I certainly don't believe you will, you wouldn't hit me. Your hand is trembling so clearly that the shot would certainly go wide, and I'll be upon you in a single bound." "And then what, sonny boy?" I asked provocatively. "I said stop right there," I repeated once more, But Leroy Staton continued to approach us with undisguised steps. I pondered only briefly, weighed the pros and cons within 1/100th of a second, aimed and pulled the trigger. With a loud cry of surprise and pain, Leroy Staton collapsed to the ground and immediately clutched his thigh with both hands. "An excellent shot!" Holmes congratulated me. He now emerged from his hiding place whilst my heart was still pounding in my throat. I had actually fired, and I had hit my target. An euphoric feeling of triumph over young Staton overcame me. I had to exercise great restraint not to spit my contempt directly in his face. Leroy Staton, however, crouched on the ground, weeping and screaming. Holmes sauntered towards him and delivered another fierce jab with his walking stick to his stomach. "Anyone who murders friends and then drowns the body parts in wine deserves nothing less. Let that be a lesson from an old man." "I have one more question," I said thoughtfully. "Why? Why did Simon Bellhouse have to die? You yourself have more than enough money. That alone cannot have been the reason." I was simply and utterly bored. Leroy Staton gave me an ice-cold stare that I shall never forget in my life and said, "You were listening to Charles Fraser, The Devil's Work. The Adventures of the Elderly Sherlock Holmes. Episode 11. Based on the characters by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. A Go Audio production.